He lived in a concrete bunker half buried in the sand. The walls were crumbling, the floor flooded with swamp water every time it rained, and the roof he built himself from scavenged driftwood and tin barely kept out the storms. For 17 years, Robert Harrill chose this flooded military bunker over civilization, and when you see what he escaped from, you'll understand why he never went back. Because 20 years before he became famous, Robert Harrill was prisoner number 437 at a North Carolina psychiatric hospital. But he wasn't insane, he was trapped. His wife put him there in 1955. Her name was Edith, and the law was on her side. Back then, a spouse could commit you without proof. No trial, no defense, just a signature on a form. One day you're arguing about money in your kitchen. The next day you're in a locked ward with bars on the windows and orderlies watching you use the bathroom. Robert was 62 years old. He'd worked his entire life, raised 8 children, survived the Great Depression by taking any job he could find. Carpentry, painting houses, fixing engines, laying brick, anything that paid, but Edith wanted him declared incompetent. She wanted control of his military pension. $18 a month. That's what his freedom was worth. The hospital was called Cherry Hospital. Red brick buildings surrounded by chain-link fences. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and unwashed bodies. 50 men crammed into rooms meant for 20. Some of them screamed at night. Some of them just stared at the walls. Some rocked back and forth on their beds for hours without stopping. Robert did none of these things. He watched, he waited, and he planned. Because there was one orderly who liked him. A young guy who worked the night shift. And Robert talked to him every single evening. Never about escape, just about life, about carpentry, about how to fix a carburetor, about the best way to hang a door so it doesn't stick. Building trust, one conversation at a time. One story at a time. Making himself useful. Making himself human. Then one night, after 2 years of waiting, Robert asked him for a favor. Just a small one. Could he borrow a spoon from the kitchen? The orderly handed it to him the next evening. A cheap metal spoon with a rounded handle. Robert took it back to his bed, and while the other patients slept, he started grinding the handle against the concrete floor. Back and forth, back and forth. For 6 hours straight, the scraping sound barely audible under the snoring and the sleep-talking. The friction burned his fingers. The metal grew hot. But he didn't stop. By morning, the tip was sharp enough to cut skin. But Robert didn't want to cut skin. He wanted to cut through a window latch. There was a bathroom on the 2nd floor. The window had a simple hook lock on the inside, and every night at 2 a.m., that bathroom was empty for exactly 15 minutes during the shift change. The orderlies would walk the halls, check the rooms, then gather in the break room for coffee and cigarettes before starting the next round. He'd been counting the timing for 8 months, memorizing the pattern, testing it, making sure. On June 3rd, 1958, Robert waited until the orderlies walked past his door. Then he shuffled to the bathroom like he'd done 1,000 times before. He locked the door behind him, climbed onto the toilet, and wedged the sharpened spoon into the gap between the window frame and the latch. It took 11 minutes of prying. His hands shook. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The metal bent, almost snapped, but the hook finally popped free and the window swung open, and Robert Harrill squeezed his 65-year-old body through a gap barely wider than his shoulders. He dropped 12 feet into a flower bed, landed hard on his side, felt something crack in his ribs. Pain shot through his chest like a hot wire, but he didn't stop. He got up, and he ran. The fence was 30 yards away, chain link, 8 feet tall, topped with barbed wire. Robert didn't even slow down. He grabbed the metal, pulled himself up. felt the wire tear through his shirt and into his shoulder as he rolled over the top. Then he hit the ground on the other side and kept moving. His lungs burned, his ribs screamed, but his legs kept pumping. By sunrise, he was 9 miles away, walking south on Highway 17, thumb out, wearing hospital pajamas with blood soaked through the sleeve. A trucker picked him up outside of Goldsboro. Didn't ask questions. Just handed Robert a cigarette and drove. Then a farmer in a pickup. Then a traveling salesman in a Buick. Robert told them all the same story. He was heading to the coast, to Fort Fisher, to a place where nobody could find him. The trip took 4 days, 260 miles of hitched rides and walking. Robert slept in tobacco fields, ate from trash cans behind diners, washed his face in gas station bathrooms, drank from garden hoses. His ribs hurt so badly he could barely breathe. But he kept moving south, always south, toward the ocean. And when he finally reached the beach at Fort Fisher, he walked through the dunes until he found what he was looking for. A concrete bunker, half buried in the sand, built during World War II to store ammunition and weapons. Abandoned for 13 years. The entrance was a dark rectangular opening. The walls inside were thick concrete, and the floor was covered in 6 inches of standing water that smelled like rotten eggs and dead fish. It was perfect, because nobody wanted it, nobody patrolled it, and nobody would think to look for him there. Robert moved in that same day. He had no supplies, no tools, no money, just the bloody hospital clothes on his back. So he started with the basics. He found a rusted frying pan in the trash behind a bait shop, scavenged driftwood from the beach for fires, filled an old paint bucket with rainwater for drinking, found a wooden pallet washed up on shore and dragged it back to use as a bed frame. The bunker was 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. The walls were 4 feet high on the outside, but the interior was taller. The original roof was damaged, partially collapsed. So Robert built his own. He collected pieces of driftwood, sheets of corrugated tin, flattened cardboard boxes, tied it all together with fishing line and rope. The roof leaked when it rained hard, but it was better than nothing. The floor stayed wet year-round, sometimes from rain dripping through his makeshift roof, sometimes from high tide seeping up through the sand. Robert set up his wooden pallet in the driest corner, but the moisture never left. His blankets were always damp. His clothes were always stiff with salt, and the smell of mildew hung in the air so thick you could taste it. The first night, mosquitoes covered every inch of his skin. They swarmed in clouds so thick he inhaled them when he breathed. He woke up with his eyelids swollen shut, his neck covered in welts. The second night, a thunderstorm flooded the bunker waist-deep. He stood in the corner shivering until dawn. The third night, he slept for 12 hours straight because, for the first time in 3 years, nobody was watching him. Nobody was counting pills. Nobody was writing notes on a clipboard. Word spread fast in a small beach town. Fishermen saw smoke coming from the bunker. Kids dared each other to peek inside the entrance, and within a week, the locals knew. There was a hermit living in the old fort. Some people brought him food, some people brought him clothes, and some people just brought questions, because Robert Harrill started talking to visitors. Not small talk, philosophy. He'd sit on a wooden crate at the entrance of his flooded bunker, wearing a torn shirt and pants held up with rope, and he'd lecture about government tyranny, about freedom, about what he called the school of common sense. He believed in 3 tyrants, 3 forces that steal your freedom. The first was government, the politicians and bureaucrats who write laws to control you. The second was banks, the institutions that trap you in debt and mortgages. The third was religion. the churches that tell you how to think and what to believe, and Robert Harrill had escaped all three. He kept a notebook, filled it with visitors' names and their hometowns, called it his guest book. A philosophy professor from Duke University came in 1960 and stayed for 3 hours, sat on a crate near the bunker entrance and took notes. A journalist from Raleigh came in 1961 and wrote a feature story. The headline called Robert the Fort Fisher Hermit. The name stuck, and people kept coming. They drove from Wilmington, from Charlotte, from Virginia and South Carolina. They parked on the beach road and walked through the dunes, and they stood around his bunker, listening to a man in muddy clothes explain why civilization was a trap, why comfort was a cage, why most people were slaves and didn't even know it. He had his 3 rules carved into a piece of driftwood nailed outside the bunker entrance. 1. Don't trust the government. 2. Don't trust banks. 3. Don't trust anyone who wants to control you. These weren't abstract ideas to Robert. He'd lived them. He'd been locked up by the government. He'd lost his pension to his wife. He'd been declared incompetent by doctors who never asked him a single question. Every rule came from experience. Every word came from pain. The tourists brought him money sometimes, coins mostly, a few dollar bills. Robert never asked for it, but he took it. Used it to buy canned beans and tobacco. He fished in the inlet with a line tied to a stick, caught croaker and spot, and cooked them over driftwood fires right outside the bunker entrance. Ate them with his hands straight out of the pan. The fish tasted like salt and smoke, the beans tasted like metal, but it was his food, earned by his hands, and that made it better than any meal he'd eaten in the hospital. He never wore shoes. His feet were covered in calluses thick as leather, cracked and split from the salt. His hair grew down to his shoulders. Gray and tangled, his beard hung to his chest, and his skin was so dark from the sun that tourists sometimes didn't realize he was white until they got close enough to see his blue eyes. The bunker floor stayed wet year-round, sometimes from rain leaking through his patchwork roof, sometimes from high tide seeping up through the sand. Robert slept on his wooden pallet to keep himself above the water, but the moisture never left. Everything he owned was damp. His few books were warped. His notebooks had pages that stuck together, and at night you could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Summer was the worst. Temperatures inside the concrete bunker hit 110 degrees. The tin roof trapped the heat. No breeze could get through. Just hot, stale air that pressed down like a weight. Robert would pour buckets of seawater over his head to cool off, then sit outside the entrance dripping while tourists asked him why he didn't just move into town, why he didn't get a room, why he didn't make his life easier. He always gave the same answer. He'd rather die free than live in a cage. By 1965, Robert Harrill was famous. Newspapers across North Carolina ran stories about the hermit philosopher. A radio station in Wilmington did a live interview. The host drove out to the bunker with the recording equipment, set up a microphone outside the entrance, and broadcast Robert's voice across eastern North Carolina. The host asked him if he missed his family. Robert said no. Asked if he missed sleeping in a bed. Robert said no. Asked if he was happy. Robert said yes, happier than he'd been in 20 years. But fame brought problems. The county government didn't like having a homeless man living in a historic military site. They sent inspectors, tried to declare the bunker unsafe, tried to evict him for trespassing on public land. Robert fought them in court 3 separate times, represented himself, walked into the courthouse in his muddy clothes and rope belt, argued that the bunker was abandoned federal property and the county had no jurisdiction. He cited property law, cited military regulations, cited constitutional rights. He won every time. Then the state tried, said he was a vagrant, said he needed to be in a supervised facility for his own safety. Robert stood in front of a judge in Wilmington wearing the same muddy clothes he'd worn for 7 years, and explained that he'd been in a supervised facility before, that he'd escaped once, that he'd do it again if they tried to put him back. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then dismissed the case. The locals loved him for it. The hermit who beat the system. They brought him food, brought him books. One woman brought him a transistor radio so he could listen to the news. Another brought him a camping chair so he wouldn't have to sit on the wet ground outside the bunker. A fisherman brought him a better frying pan. A teacher brought him notebooks for his writing. A construction worker brought him better materials for his roof. Robert accepted everything with gratitude. He'd thank them, offer them a seat, tell them stories about freedom and tyranny. Some visitors stayed for 10 minutes, some stayed for 3 hours. Robert never rushed anyone, never turned anyone away. The bunker became a destination, a place where people came to hear truth spoken plainly. But not everyone was friendly. Teenagers from Wilmington would drive out at night, stand outside the bunker and throw rocks at his tin roof, shout insults, call him crazy, call him a bum, call him a dirty old man who should be locked up. Robert ignored them mostly. But one night in 1968, a group of 6 boys climbed into the bunker while he was sleeping. They grabbed him, dragged him out to the beach, and held him down in the sand while one of them poured a bottle of whiskey on his face and took photographs. The pictures showed up in a local yearbook, captioned, "Visiting the Hermit." Robert was 75 years old in those photos. You can see his arms pinned to the sand. You can see the terror in his eyes. You can see the boys laughing, grinning for the camera. He reported it to the sheriff, showed up at the station with bruises on his arms. The sheriff did nothing, said it was just kids having fun, said Robert should be grateful anyone paid attention to him, said maybe he should move somewhere else if he didn't like it. Robert didn't move, but he changed. 2 months later, Robert disappeared. A fisherman found the bunker empty on a Tuesday morning. The frying pan was still on the ground. The guest book was still on the crate. The radio was still playing. But Robert was gone. His chair was knocked over. His blankets were scattered. Something was wrong. Search parties walked the beach, checked the inlet, checked the woods behind the dunes, asked every local, asked every shop owner. Nobody had seen him. They found him 3 days later, 5 miles north, locked inside an abandoned fishing shack. His hands were tied behind his back with rope. There was a gag in his mouth, and he was dehydrated so badly his lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue was swollen. His eyes were sunken. He could barely speak. He told the police that 2 men grabbed him while he was fishing at dawn, put a bag over his head, dragged him to a car, drove him up the coast, and locked him in the shack. Left him there without water, without food. He didn't know why. He didn't know who. He heard them laughing, heard them say something about teaching the old man a lesson. Then they left him there to die. A jogger found him by accident, heard him kicking the wall, called the police. The police investigated for 2 weeks, interviewed locals, checked for fingerprints, never found anyone, never charged anyone. The case went cold within a month. Robert went back to his bunker, but he changed after that, stopped talking to strangers as much, stopped keeping the guest book updated, started sleeping with a knife tucked under his pallet, started keeping a stick near the entrance. His visitors noticed he flinched when someone approached too quickly. Noticed he positioned himself where he could always see the entrance. For the next 4 years he lived quietly. The tourists still came, but fewer of them, and Robert was more selective about who he invited inside. The bunker was falling apart. The walls were crumbling. The rebar was exposed and rusting. The water level was rising because the sand was eroding. Some days the floor was ankle deep. Some days it was knee deep. Robert would sit in his chair with water lapping at his shins and talk about freedom like nothing had changed. On June 7, 1972, a couple walking the beach found Robert lying face down inside the bunker. His body was partially submerged in 4 inches of water. There was a gash on the back of his head. Blood had pooled on the concrete. His face was in the water. His hands were near his sides. The coroner ruled it accidental. Said Robert slipped on the wet floor, hit his head on the exposed rebar, drowned in the shallow water. The report listed his age as 79. Listed his occupation as hermit. Listed his next of kin as none. But the locals didn't believe it, because Robert Harrill had lived in that bunker for 17 years. He knew every inch of that space. He'd walked that floor 10,000 times in the dark, in the rain, in standing water. And he'd never slipped once, never even stumbled. His feet knew every crack in the concrete, every piece of rebar, every uneven spot. Some said the teenagers came back. Some said it was the men who kidnapped him. Some said it was someone who wanted the bunker for themselves. Some said it was the government finally getting revenge for the court embarrassments. The police never investigated. The case was closed within 48 hours. The body was released. The bunker was emptied. His few possessions were thrown away. They buried Robert Harrill in a pauper's grave in Wilmington. No headstone, no ceremony. Just a numbered plot in the county cemetery. The grave wasn't even marked. But the people who knew him didn't forget. They placed a marker at the bunker, a simple wooden cross with his name burned into the wood. Robert E. Harrill, the Fort Fisher Hermit, 1893 to 1972. He lived free. For years after his death, visitors still came to Fort Fisher. They'd stand at the entrance of the bunker and leave coins on the concrete, leave flowers, leave notes. Some of the notes said, "Thank you." Some said, "Rest in peace." Some just said, "You were right about everything." Because Robert Harrill lived exactly the way he wanted to live. He chose a flooded concrete bunker over a psychiatric ward. Chose mosquitoes and mildew over medication and monitoring. Chose 17 years of wet feet and tin roofs over a lifetime of safety and supervision. He could have left at any time, could have gotten a job, could have rented a room, could have reconciled with his family, but he didn't. Because the bunker wasn't about survival. It was about principle. And when you look at that choice, really look at it, you start to understand something. The bunker wasn't a prison. The bunker was the escape. Civilization was the cage. The hospitals, the courts, the laws, the expectations, the control. All the invisible chains that most people accept without question. Robert Harrill was the only one brave enough to admit it. Brave enough to walk away. Brave enough to live in a flooded concrete bunker for 17 years just to prove a point. He spent 17 years in that bunker. 17 years of heat and cold and floods and mosquitoes. 17 years of tourists and teenagers and court battles. 17 years of telling anyone who would listen that freedom matters more than comfort. That independence matters more than safety. That you can't be truly alive if someone else controls your life. And he died exactly where he wanted to be, on his own terms, in his own space, free.